The year is 1487. A pale moon hangs above a fortress of blackened stone, its towers piercing the night like jagged teeth. The wind that coils through the courtyard carries with it the smell of damp earth, smoke from torches, and the faint copper tang of rusting iron. Before we start the story, I heard that all of you are listening from different places throughout the world. I appreciate it. Please comment below where you're listening from. If you enjoy the story, then please tap the like button and subscribe for more upcoming stories like this. Okay, let's continue the story. You stand before the gates, carved with symbols whose meaning has long been forgotten, though their presence still unsettles the heart. Inside, the great hall shudders with music and laughter, the sound rolling against the high arches like distant thunder. Long tables groan under the weight of roasted boar, spiced bread, and goblets brimming with red wine. Yet it is not hunger that drives the eyes of those who sit there. Each noble, dressed in silks and heavy jewels, hides behind a mask of delight, while their hands tighten on the edges of their cups. They smile at one another. They toast to loyalty and friendship. But the air is heavy with suspicion, as though every glance carries the weight of accusation. In the shadows, servants move quickly and quietly, their ears catching more truth than the histories would ever dare record. To the chroniclers of the age, this was a gathering of power, of alliances forged and dynasties strengthened. Yet those who lingered in the margins, the torchbearers, the wine pourers, the guards who stood in silence knew what the gilded records could never tell. They knew the rustle of a hidden dagger beneath a cloak, the shift in tone when a vow of brotherhood slipped into a threat, the tremor in a voice when promises were made that would never be kept. This is the true face of history, not the polished image carved into marble, but the trembling breath before betrayal, the hushed laughter after a crime, the silence in a hall once the candles are extinguished. And it is here, in the forgotten corners of 1487, that we step into the shadows to uncover what was never meant to be spoken aloud. Beyond the feasting tables of 1487, where laughter masked unease, the castle walls themselves held stories too dark for the songs of minstrels or the ink of chroniclers. They were built thick, meant to withstand sieges and storms. Yet even stone has a way of listening. The corridors twisted like veins, cold drafts whispering through every crack, carrying with them the echoes of conversations that were never meant to linger. If you walked those passages alone, you might swear you heard footsteps just behind you, though no shadow ever followed. Servants swore that doors locked tight would sometimes open to reveal chambers already occupied by unseen guests. The castle was alive, not with spirits in chains, but with secrets breathed into its very mortar. For every banquet held in the great hall, a dozen clandestine meetings took place in the lower chambers where torchlight barely touched the damp walls. There, promises of loyalty were exchanged in hushed voices, while oaths were broken with the press of a concealed blade. One knight might swear eternal service to his lord, only to whisper rebellion into the ear of a rival before dawn. Even queens and princesses, veiled in silk and gold, carried hidden desires that could unravel kingdoms. Behind their smiles at courtly dances, letters were slipped into waiting hands, letters that carried not words of devotion, but instructions, warnings, or pleas that could decide the fate of thousands. History often prefers to tell us of battles fought in daylight, where banners clashed on open fields, but the truth is that the fate of kingdoms was just as often decided in chambers where a single candle burned low and the walls leaned close to listen. And so the castle became more than stone. It was a witness. It absorbed every broken vow, every whispered threat, every forbidden touch exchanged in the silence of night. To walk its halls was to feel the weight of those who had walked before you, their ambitions pressed into the floor like footprints in wet earth. And as the feast continued above, with music drowning out the unease, below the surface of celebration something darker pulsed an unspoken certainty that before the year was done, blood would be spilled not only on the battlefield, but within these very walls. As the moon drifted higher above the battlements, the feast in the great hall reached its height. Minstrels strummed their lutes with quickened fingers, and dancers spun in circles, their jeweled skirts scattering light like sparks from a fire. To any stranger stepping in from the cold night, it would have seemed a scene of pure joy, a gathering of allies bound together by loyalty and shared triumphs. But those who knew the undercurrent of the evening could taste the bitterness hiding beneath the sweetness. Every laugh felt too sharp, every toast too eager, as though each guest tried to outshine the shadow looming above them. Whispers traveled faster than the music, slipping from ear to ear like a current impossible to contain. Some claimed a noble house had betrayed its sworn oath to the crown, selling secrets to a rival power across the sea. Others insisted that a child born in secrecy now threatened to claim a throne meant for another. And then there were those who spoke of curses, that the very foundations of the castle were soaked in blood from an older age, when its stones were laid with the bones of those who resisted its rise. Servants heard these rumors as they poured wine and carried platters, and though they would never speak aloud in daylight, their eyes carried the weight of knowledge. To them, the feast was not celebration, but performance, a masquerade where every smile masked a wound. The torches burned low, dripping wax-like tears onto the stone floor, and the smell of spiced meat turned sour in the stomachs of those who could sense what was to come. Some guests left early, retreating to their chambers under the pretense of fatigue, though in truth they wished to be near their weapons, should the night end with a cry instead of a song. And still the music played, as though the strings themselves feared silence, for silence would bring the truth rushing in. What no one could deny was that power was shifting like sand beneath their feet. Tonight might end in merriment, but by morning the hall could be draped in black, its laughter replaced by the tolling of iron bells. While the hall above pulsed with uneasy celebration, far below, in the belly of the castle, another world stirred. The dungeon stretched like a labyrinth, carved from stone so old it seemed to sweat with the memory of centuries. Torches sputtered against the damp, their flames bending as though afraid of what they revealed. Chains clinked faintly in the distance, though some cells had long been empty, their last inhabitants nothing more than bones scattered to dust. Yet it was not only prisoners who haunted these depths. These chambers served as a meeting place for those whose dealings could never survive the daylight. Cloaked figures gathered in corners, their whispers muffled by the thick walls, exchanging coins, promises, and threats in equal measure. A guard, weary and half-drunk, might be persuaded to look the other way for a pouch of silver, while a messenger, pale with fear, delivered scrolls bound in wax and sealed with crests that should never have left a noble hand. The air smelled of mildew and iron, but beneath it lurked the sharper scent of betrayal. Here, alliances were not sworn before witnesses and written in ink, but carved into flesh with a dagger's edge. Those who descended into the dungeon knew they might not return unchanged, for the walls had a way of swallowing the truth, keeping it hidden even from those who thought themselves masters of secrets. And above, the feast carried on, unknowing or perhaps willfully blind. A queen lifted her goblet, her eyes glittering with something colder than candlelight. A lord pressed a hand to his chest as though in pledge, but in truth he felt for the blade tucked beneath his cloak. And in the kitchens, the humblest of servants overheard a name spoken too softly, a name that once released could ignite a fire greater than any torch. The castle was a body, its heart beating in the hall, its veins twisting through the corridors, and its stomach rotting in the dungeons. And like any living thing, it carried both strength and sickness. In 1487, the sickness was spreading, slow but unstoppable, and every guest who raised a glass above could sense it without daring to admit it. The laughter grew louder, as though noise itself could hold back the tide, but the silence beneath the silence of the dungeon was stronger, and it waited patiently to rise. As the night deepened, the banquet began to unravel in subtle ways that only the most attentive noticed. The music slowed, no longer joyous but restless, the notes sharp and uneasy like blades scraping stone. Candles burned low, their wax pooling on the tables, and the laughter of nobles faltered into pauses that stretched too long to be comfortable. A lord at the far end of the hall leaned to whisper into his neighbor's ear, his words swallowed by the murmur of the crowd. But the glance that followed his whisper was enough to send a ripple of unease across the table. A lady, pale beneath her jeweled headdress, excused herself suddenly, her hand trembling as she lifted her skirts to flee the hall. Some thought she had drunk too much wine, but others suspected she knew something yet unspoken. Rumors had already begun to shift into certainty. It was said that a betrayal had been uncovered, a betrayal so grave that it threatened to undo the alliances binding every family represented in that room. Some believed the treachery belonged to one of the great houses, its heir plotting to trade loyalty for promises from across the sea. Others whispered of a bastard child, born of secret passion, whose claim to inheritance could unravel the crown itself. Still others said the curse upon the castle was waking, a curse older than stone and stronger than blood. Servants moved quicker now, their trays rattling, their eyes darting toward the shadows, as if fearing they might suddenly leap forward. Even the dogs at the edge of the hall began to grow restless, their low growls vibrating beneath the din of music and talk. The king, if king he could still be called, lifted his goblet with a hand that shook too slightly for anyone to ignore. His voice, once steady as iron, cracked when he spoke, though the words themselves were strong. He called for loyalty, for unity, for the bonds of brotherhood to hold firm against rumor and fear. And yet, as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward the doors, toward the dark corridors beyond, as though expecting them to burst open at any moment. Those gathered raised their glasses in reluctant echo, their voices unconvincing, their hands heavy. And in that moment, the feast ceased to be a celebration at all. It became a stage, every noble an actor, every servant an unwilling witness, the script written not in ink, but in dread. Outside, the night pressed against the walls, heavy and silent, as if the world itself were waiting to see who would strike first. By the time the final candle sputtered and died, the castle had fallen into an uneasy hush. The music had ended hours before, though the echoes of its last note still seemed to linger in the rafters like a ghost, reluctant to leave. The nobles retired to their chambers one by one, each departure marked by hushed whispers and darting eyes, as though none trusted the others enough to turn their backs. The feast was finished, but the true drama of the night had only begun to unfold. Somewhere in the corridors, a scream rang out, sharp and fleeting, quickly swallowed by silence. Servants froze, their hands clutching trays, their eyes wide, as though they feared the very walls might accuse them. In the great hall, only a few torches remained, their flames bending weakly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist into shapes unholy. Beneath the stones, the dungeons stirred, and those who had whispered secrets earlier in the night now found themselves shackled by their own words, betrayed by lips that had loosened too freely. Above, the king sat alone, his goblet untouched, his gaze heavy with the knowledge that before dawn his crown might weigh no more than a chain upon his neck. Some chronicles record that the night ended without blood, that the alliances held and the kingdom endured. But the stories whispered in villages, in markets, and by weary travelers at roadside inns tell a different tale. They speak of a knife flashing in the dark, of a body left cold upon the rushes of the hall, of oaths broken not with words but with steel. They say the curse of the castle claimed its due that night, binding its stones ever tighter with the weight of sin. And perhaps that is why even now, centuries later, travelers who pass the ruins of that fortress say they hear faint laughter carried on the wind, mingled with the clang of goblets and the sharp cry of betrayal. History leaves us the names of kings and the dates of battles, but it is these shadows, these whispered accounts of nights, steeped in secrecy, that shape the truth of the past. And so, as the night of 1487 faded into memory, the feast became legend, and the legend became warning that power is never secure, loyalty is never pure, and the darkest mysteries of history are often written not in books, but in the silence that follows a scream.